Welcome to the Newtown Big Dreams podcast, an interview-style talk show that's your gateway to the fabulous and fascinating people who relocated to start a new life. Whether you're new to our podcast or your city, our fellow neighbors from across Canada, North America, and the entire English-speaking world share their stories of reaching new horizons and big dreams. So sit back and relax as we navigate in-depth and intimate conversations with entrepreneurs, thought leaders, executives, creatives, and anyone who can share their story about their Newtown big dreams. And now, here's your host, Luke J. Menkes.
So I'm here this morning with Deanne from Stepping Stones Counseling Group. Deanne, thanks for coming in today.
Thank you. Good morning.
It's great to meet you.
You too.
So you came to Kelowna about 20 years ago.
About 20 years ago now, yeah.
Tell us the story of how you got here.
Well, I spent part of my teenage years in the North Okanagan, and many years ago, you couldn't complete a degree in Kelowna, so I started my education and then moved to Vancouver to complete my first degree, and then spent some time working there and realized I really wanted to be back in the Okanagan, closer to family.
Right.
And so started to figure out how to make that big leap back, and decided that Kelowna was a place for me because I could practice my counseling practice as well as be close enough to my family, but far enough away too.
Right.
So it was a great kind of place to land.
Right.
Yeah.
So have you been in counseling since you left college, university?
Yeah, I did my undergrad degree in psychology, and for many years I worked in group homes for teenagers in both Kelowna and Vancouver. And then many years after that, I went back and did a master's in counseling.
I see.
So my professional work has always been in the field of counseling.
Right. And do you primarily deal with children and youth or adults too?
I specialize with children, and what I've learned over my career is those children grow up and they still want to come back occasionally as grown-ups. So I tend to see a real variety of ages now, which is quite lovely.
Nice. Yeah. And so speaking of the adults that you treated when they were younger, do you notice real improvement in some of them?
Absolutely. I wouldn't keep doing what I was doing if it wasn't helpful. I think it's the therapeutic relationship is become more and more apparent to me how powerful that is. And when somebody comes back to see you 10 years later and they're now a young adult and they, there was key things that they remembered that were useful and meaningful in the conversations and the things they decided to work on. Yeah. It's really exciting. It's one of my favorite parts of my job is when somebody comes back as an adult and it's like, oh my God, you're so tall. And it's so cool to now see you at this new stage of life too.
That's really nice. Yeah. Is it difficult for you? Because you surely must hear of and emotionally experience a lot of traumatic things that children go through. Yeah. Does that wear on you as an individual?
Absolutely.
How do you deal with that?
It would impact any brain. And I think it's essential that you balance the work that you do with taking very special care of your brain and your body. For me, I'm very fortunate that in my practice, I've been able to work with animals for the last 16, 17 years. And I think that has taking care of my brain as well.
I see.
So the longevity of me being able to do trauma work and focus in trauma work is extended because I do animal-assisted therapy.
How do animals help?
Well, animals help because they allow us to regulate, right, by their physical presence. If we're an animal, if we enjoy animals, obviously for people who don't enjoy animals, that would be dysregulating. But, petting an animal, having an animal physically close and kind of that oxytocin that gets released when we're proximally close with a dog is super, super helpful for brains who've had too much cortisol. So I kind of think of it like a teeter-totter, right? And if you're going to have, a lot of toxic stuff happening to your brain, how do you equal that out with lots of nature, lots of animals, lots of therapeutic relationships? And those are all things that really build the foundation for healing brains.
Right.
Yeah.
And it must be a challenge because if you're going to be empathetic and really understand what the patient is going through, have you had many occasions where you were just kind of horrified?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And horrified, but then you also get the opposite spectrum of just absolutely amazed and I don't even know the most powerful word to use, but like stunned at people's capacity to survive and to heal. So it's not, for me, it's a very hope-filled world that I work in. For some, I think it would be very overwhelming, but I think I'm at a place in a space where I've figured out how to protect my brain as well as continue to do the work that I'm just so excited and honored to do.
What is the youngest patient that you deal with?
The youngest child that I have worked like individually with was probably 3.5. Wow. Typically, I would work with a parent and a child of that age together. But if there's a case of a disrupted attachment or a trauma, or there's not an attachment figure available, then I might do some individual work with somebody of that age. But usually the younger the brain, the more I need a caregiver or another adult brain there to work alongside with.
Yeah.
I mean, pretty young brains go through really hard things, right?
Do the children benefit from the animal therapy as well?
Absolutely. It's one of the most helpful tools for trauma or attachment work, because it's safe. Often it's not an animal that's hurt a child. Typically it's a human being. So animals can almost be a bridge to connection and to repair and to experiencing touch in a way that is by the child's choice.
Right.
So I think of Murphy's my current therapy dog. I think of him as a bridge, right, to doing lots of the work that would be it wouldn't be impossible for me to do, but I think that he allows things to the work to go deeper quicker, because he's another available relationship in the room.
Right.
And if they feel trusting and safe and connected to him, there's a kind of a gentle automatic transference that, oh, well, then Deanne must be safe and trusting and okay. And I can kind of watch her and check her out. And I'm going to watch Murphy and check them out. And as I feel safer, we can kind of get into the work.
Murphy is no doubt a very gentle and kind animal.
Yes.
And I think a lot of children who go through trauma probably feel a sense of being judged by an older person.
Absolutely.
Even when they might understand logically that the abuse or whatever they went through was not their fault. There's a sense, I believe, with children that there must be something unworthy or unlovable. If an older person has done this to them. I remember thinking as a kid that my parents were perfect, and they kind of instilled that. Part of the, you have to respect your elders, went to a point of they could do no wrong, even when they were abusive sometimes. Right. So I think, a nice animal is very non-judgmental and just loves you no matter what.
Yeah, absolutely.
So do the children respond immediately to Murphy?
It's always interesting to watch how they connect and what they seek from him. Now at this point in my career, probably 98% of people I work with want animal assisted therapy. So that's lovely for me because I just prefer that he's in the room. Some kids just prefer he's kind of over there and they check in with him every now and again. And other children want him very close and they almost pet him the entire session as they regulate and as they talk. Nice. That might be more teens too. And then some children I say they need the bookend, right? They need the greeting from Murphy and they need goodbye from Murphy. But in the middle, he just kind of sleeps. Right. So it depends on every child, and I have to book those sessions accordingly because I have to think about Murphy's needs as well. Right. And you have cats, but dogs primarily would sleep most of the day, right? So if he was home and not working, he would be napping most of the day. So I have to make sure that I'm not overdoing it with him, and that I'm thinking about his emotional needs as well. If I have, say, 3 high need children in a row, that's going to be difficult for him. So he needs, a high need, then a lower need, and then medium need, just so he can regulate as well. Because animals, we can't force them to do this work. It has to be enjoyable for him as well.
Makes sense. Yeah. Does Murphy live with you?
Yes, he does.
How did you select him for this role?
Oh, that's a great
Was he a
question.
pet or?
No, I purposefully selected him. So I had another therapy dog who lived for 10 years and practiced for 9. And he was a Bernese Mountain Dog. And when I started doing research on dogs, I grew up with dogs, but I didn't grow up with Bernese Mountain Dogs. When I started doing research on, I could get the dog I wanted, what would I get for therapy? And learning that Bernese are fabulous with children, that they're really calm temperament. They're not, a high energy dog. So I adopted my first one as a puppy and trained him. And he was very successful. I would say Murphy is even more suited to the work. So when my first dog passed away, I started working with a breeder in Alberta and letting her know what my intention was and what my needs were. And when the litter was born, flew out there and visited them. And then she did a series of temperament tests on the litter. I kind of knew which one I fell in love with. But then you do a series of kind of temperament tests to see what their style is, right? So I don't want a dog that would be considered prey driven, because they want to fetch a lot and they want to do that kind of that really interactive play.
Wrestling.
Yeah. I need a dog who's really relationally attuned, that kind of likes to cuddle but isn't super needy. So I don't want the dog on either end of the pack. I kind of want a dog in the middle of the pack who, isn't terribly shy but isn't terribly bold. And Bernese are just beautiful for that. The only really difficult thing is they have a short lifespan. So Murphy is now 6. So I'll get a puppy next year, which is great for me.
Is 6 considered old age?
For him it is, for his breed. Their breed life expectancy is very, very short. My previous one made it almost a 10, which is exceptional. But the learning from that is I want to retire Murphy before he has to be retired, because it's very difficult for the children to go through sudden loss. And my previous dog was healthy. There was no health concerns, but then he suddenly got cancer and died within 2 weeks, and that was not good for the kids.
Right.
So I want to have 2 dogs so I can stagger them.
Yeah.
And then I can also have a different dog for different children, which is exciting for me. So I'm going to have a female Bernese this time. I've never trained a female for therapy before.
Right. Is there a big difference?
I'm curious to find out.
And how do you determine the temperament of a little puppy?
They do some really interesting little kind of experiential tests with them. So you would have a neutral person who doesn't know the group of puppies come in, and you would have them do different little activities. Like you would take each puppy. One would be you would take each puppy and put it on its back, and to see how long does it struggle for, right? Does it ever stop struggling? How soon does it stop struggling, and how soon does it relax and settle in?
Interesting.
You would do other things like toss a couple toys across the room and see which puppies run first, right? And do those a few times, and do those with 3 different people. And then you get kind of a sense of I know you can't call it a personality, but a doganality, of their kind of way of being too. Right? Because there's lots of dogs that don't make it as therapy dogs. There's lots of dogs that don't make it as service dogs. There's, it's a very special dog that, say could be like a service dog in a facility.
Right. Interesting.
Yeah.
Very interesting. So what happens to a child's brain when they suffer a trauma?
Oh, that's a great question. Depending on what age, right? So trauma can occur in utero as well. So when a baby is forming in the womb, there can be developmental trauma. So things like poverty, things like abuse, things like, depending on what part of the world you're living in, can influence that environment.
Interesting.
Right?
So if the mother is experiencing a lot of cortisol,
yes.
a lot of stress hormones, that's what that affects the baby's brain.
Yeah, because if you think about it, the baby's brain is washing in cortisol.
Yeah. Right?
So then you have a baby born kind of already tuned up.
Yeah.
And then depending on what happens next, different parts of kind of our experiences then will activate different parts of our, genetic expression.
Interesting. So it could be like a long-term stress of poverty.
Absolutely.
And just stress about getting evicted and, constant worry. Or an abrupt stress of being hit.
A single event.
Abused. Yeah.
Or it could be ongoing, right?
Yeah.
And relational trauma, right? So that's trauma that occurs in the relationship.
Yeah.
That's incredibly impactful long-term for us, right? We know that kind of the blueprint for relationships is set in that 0 to 2 time frame. So if there's a lot of chaos or a lot of disruption or parents are not able to be present, attuned, and attentive, we're going to have a brain that's not developing in kind of an optimal situation.
Right.
And then that kind of sets, what one of my teachers would say is kind of a cascade effect, right? A cascade of compromise.
Yeah.
Right. So it's it can have long-term devastating impacts for generations is what we know now.
Wow.
Right.
So you could have a child that is having symptoms And the mother might tell you that this child was not abused, but I was when the child was an infant or before it was born.
Yes.
And that may be a cause of some of these symptoms. And how can you tell when a child has suffered from trauma? Unless another adult tells you.
Yeah.
How can you tell?
You see things in terms of development. So a child who's had severe significant neglect, there's an FOC, a measurement that smart people, doctors would do, the frontal occipital cortex. And for children who've had pervasive neglect, that measurement will be much smaller than for children who've had kind of the foundation that they've needed for development. So you can tell, from body structure, from head circumference. You can tell, you can learn a lot through different types of assessments, right? So even looking at muscle tone, right? Looking at, is there a flatness to the back of the head? Was the child left laying alone a lot in a crib? Is there like a lack of kind of core muscle strength, right? Was there a lack of stimulation? So you would look across all domains, and then you would look at, impact, right? So, and brains are impacted, depending on where it was at in development, right? So if you had a child that had, say, optimal development up until the age of 4 and then was in a pretty significant car accident, that's a different type of brain to work with than a child who had pervasive developmental trauma with no supports and then has a car accident, right?
Right.
So the way that I would support those brains is different. Right. And my kind of expectations on how those brains, or my hopes on how those brains would heal, is going to be different.
I see. And is there psychological signs as well in a small child? Like even if they're not fluent in English yet, can you see psychological signs of trauma?
And that's why play therapy is a modality that I've practiced in for 20, 25 years, because children's first language is play, right? So, I worked with a 3.5-year-old. He was verbal, but he didn't have a lot to say through words, but he had a lot to show me through play. And his play was very chaotic. It was, nothing made sense. There was just a lot of activation and violence and things like that, right?
So you throw things? Throw his toys?
Sometimes, yeah. Or I have different types of toys in a therapeutic playroom than, say, you would typically have at home. I have puppets. I have a sand tray, which is a really interesting way to work with images and things like that. So they're more like projection type of toys. So he wouldn't necessarily come and, be violent in the playroom, but his play would be very intense, and there would be a lot of threat and a lot of can't get away kind of stuff, right? Because he's playing out his experience and trying to make sense of it.
Yeah.
Right.
And how do you heal the brain?
Well, that's a great question. First, we need to make sure that we have the essentials for attachment, right? We need to have a present, attuned, attentive caregiver who has a pretty good understanding of their own trauma history or the way that their brain is set up. Ideally, we'd have 2 of those.
Right.
But we need to start with the basics, right? A child needs a safe place to be.
Yeah.
They need to know that, there's no threat. They need to know that there's predictability to when they'll eat. They need to know that their caregiver is well taken care of, right? A mom who's in a violent situation, a child, we can't help that brain heal until mom's brain is safe. Right. So we need to look at kind of the larger picture too. And poverty is huge for children. The oppression of that and the long-term impact of that. I think having access to trauma therapy earlier on makes so much sense than waiting until we have kind of a cumulative effect of trauma over a lifetime to try and provide supports. And that's when we see kind of a plate full of issues, right? We see coping skills that have then become maladaptive and are getting in the way. So I'm a big proponent and a big advocate of we need to fund things much earlier, because that's when we have the most impact on brains.
Yeah.
Brains are amazing, but we want to be cost effective in how we kind of support them.
Right.
Right.
How do you deal with a situation if the child is brought to you, but the child is still in a bit of a hostile, not ideal environment at home? I mean, it kind of feels like you're swimming upstream,
right,
I guess.
Right. And I think it would depend on if there's other types of services and systems involved, right? If it's if we would look at who are the collaborative people surrounding this family, right? What is going to move this towards safety? Does, are there legal issues or does the ministry need to be involved, right? You can't come in and provide counseling and therapeutic services if we don't have kind of that, the stability of at least safety, right? In that case, I might not see the child, I might see the parents and really work with them towards, how do we get to a place where, it is safe for your child's brain to start doing some of this work, right?
Are there a lot of foster children that you deal with?
Yes. So we're a private business, but we're also contracted by MCFD, and we also have different funding through the province that we can access, say through the Crime Victims Assistance Program. So children who've experienced sexual abuse or who have experienced domestic violence, there's funding through the province that they can access services such as ours.
Right.
And we've been a long-term contractor with MCFD because I love to work with all children, but I'm particularly passionate to work with children who've had attachment injury, complex loss, trauma, and those are typically kids in care have had all of those things, right?
I'm curious, but I don't know much about the foster children system. Is it fairly common? Like how many kids are in the system?
A lot. I can't pull the number directly out of my head, but I know I believe it's over 1,500 kids in BC.
Wow.
Right? And disproportionately Aboriginal children as well.
Wow. So it could be an abusive situation or the parents died in an accident is another possibility. And if a parent dies, usually we'll try to find a relative, right? Yeah. But if there's not a stable situation, they get put into foster care. And how does one become a foster parent?
There's the BC government website would have information on that, and it's from my understanding it's a series of taking workshops, having a home study done. It's a process. Right. Certainly I think there's always a need for people who want to provide that type of support and relationship to children. I think it's a very, very difficult system that has a very, very difficult job to do. Yeah. But certainly on the government website, or even if you just wanted to Google like how to become a foster parent in BC, it would put you through the steps. And I think there's regular ongoing workshops and opportunities to get through that training, because I think that's an ongoing need, is to continue to develop placements.
Right. So when it comes to a teenager and someone who's quite verbal, maybe in school, getting ready to go to university, what is being done to heal that brain?
So like a brain that's maybe had trauma? Or,
for an older child.
There's all kinds of different modalities, right? So, play therapy is a modality, animal-assisted therapy is a modality. There's also neurotherapies like EMDR or neurofeedback, which work with computer programs and different ways to stimulate the brain so that you don't always have to do traditional talk therapy, right? So, and then there's also other types of therapy like cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavioral therapy. So as a therapist, I like to think that I have different offerings. So I don't just work with one style of brain. I work with many brains. Right. So art therapy might be really helpful for one brain, and another brain goes, that's not for me. Right. So I have a whole bunch of things, and I offer them, and I see what fits for their personality, what fits for their need, what fits for their brain's need at that time. So often it's a mix of things, and it depends on what's happening currently as well. And I work with a lot of students, and that's really fun work too, right? Where they're kind of navigating that transition between, teenagehood and young adulthood, and that's a big step. So oftentimes that's when my little kids might be coming back, right? They're at the next developmental phase, and so often I say they pop up. They pop up at the next kind of developmental phase. Coming in for a few sessions and kind of refresh their tools and their strategies and their understanding of how their brain works, and then off they go. Right. Yeah.
So would a typical teenager that comes to see you have suffered a recent trauma, or was it something in the past and they say there's something not right with my brain, with my psychology?
It could be both.
And I don't know what it is.
Yeah, it could be both, right? So we could have somebody who's had a recent assault. We could have somebody who's had a recent car accident. Or it could be cumulative, right? Is that they might have had childhood trauma and I saw them for a period of time, and and things were going relatively well. So we took a break. Then they might have had a car accident, or there might have been, sudden loss of a caregiver, which can be really tricky for a child who's had attachment injury. So, life continues, as do negative life events. So those, sometimes will bring kids back.
Yeah. Are there a lot of cases of teenagers who say, I've got some sort of issue, but I don't know what caused it? I don't remember from my childhood. Is that fairly common or no?
I don't see that a lot. I see a lot of teenagers who do a lot of research, right? And that can be positive and negative depending on how they internalize the information that they find. So I find teenagers are quite knowledgeable about mental health diagnosis and things like that. Some of the teenagers, right?
Yeah.
So that depending on how they use that information, right? That could be a positive or negative.
Yeah.
I also see teenagers who want to make sense of their story. Right. So I often say, I'm not an archaeologist. I don't go digging and looking. Things will present themselves when brains are feeling ready. Right. So, and if I push and I push and I push and I think, there's something we got to find under here.
Right.
That's not helpful therapeutic energy. Right. Whereas if I create the space and place for that, we're going to let your brain do what it needs to do. And we're going to trust that it's going to figure out what it needs to do. Brains go where they need to go.
Right. You mentioned sometimes the research they do is not helpful.
Yes.
Can you think of an example?
There's some pretty significant labels that people can attach to, right? And I just, I'm always curious with how are you going to use that information, right? And self-diagnosing can be tricky, whether it's a medical issue or a mental health issue. Google Doctor is great, but you need to really consult, with professionals and I think just to be cautious, right? I think sometimes there can be kind of I'll say this word kind of gently, almost like a contagious effect amongst peers, right? Where, I have this, I'm struggling with depression. Well, I'm struggling with this and I'm struggling with that. And I just want to be cautious that they're using that information in a way that's helpful for them and that they're not identifying in a way that could be negative or
Right. Could an example be a teenager self-diagnoses himself and says, I've determined that I'm bipolar. And whether or not it's true, he's attached a label to himself and he's given himself kind of a stigma.
Yeah.
Is that...
and I think how does he identify that label? Is it a stigma or is it a sense of strength and connection? Because some people connect through labels and diagnosis. Well, I have this and I have that. Right?
Yeah. Hopefully it helps to understand.
Hopefully, right? That's all.
Causes understanding.
Yeah. And that it isn't internalized as a negative thing or something, that's shameful. Right? Labels are just information. Right. They are not the person.
Right.
And I think with significant labels, we want to be careful about how they're being internalized. I think with any label, actually. Right.
When it comes to the science, you've been doing this for a while.
Yeah.
Is there anything new in the last, 20, 30 years? When I study things, I like to study the history of things too. I'm fascinated by technology, but I would love to read stories of the Wright brothers and how they use bicycle parts. You know what I mean? So have there been big changes in psychology? Huge.
Neurobiology, right? Understanding how the impact between, the brain I'm born with and then the experiences I have has been tremendous. Our understanding of the brain has grown in light years over the last 10 to 15 years.
Wow.
And what's really exciting now is seeing and hearing and reading things about smart sciencey people who are making the connection between the gut and the brain. Right, and the gut health and the bacterial health in our digestive system is so connected to our mental wellness and into kind of the whole kind of system of us, right? And I'm excited to see the next 10 years what we learn about that and how we can use that as helpful information to kind of shore up some of the stuff that we're already doing.
Right.
Yeah.
Are there any books you could recommend to us?
Nothing specifically about that, about like gut brain health, because I haven't actually even found anything myself. In terms of my passion around developmental trauma, neurobiology, and how do we heal brains, I'm a huge fan of Dr. Bruce Perry's work.
Okay.
And I've studied with the Child Trauma Academy out of Houston, Texas, and him for the last I think 12 years, and he's written a number of books. The first book he wrote was called The Boy Who Was Raised as a Dog. It's a fascinating book about different experiences he's had in the field of psychiatry throughout his career, and he's worked in some pretty significant cases in the States. The second book he wrote was called Born for Love, and it's about the brain and how important a relationship is, and how empathy either develops or doesn't develop. And I think that's super important for us as a community,
Right.
To know these things. Right?
Yeah.
I think it's fundamental for us as a community to understand how brains work and where we can have the most positive influence,
For sure.
and how to better allocate our resources to help those brains heal so that we don't have a continued negative ripple effect generations and generations down the road.
Yeah.
He's got another book coming out, I think, this year. I don't know the title, but anybody that is curious about him, there's all kinds of great videos on YouTube or on the Child Trauma Academy site. He gives a ton of information away for free, which is really awesome.
Yeah. Dr. Bruce Perry.
Dr. Bruce Perry.
I'm curious about that first book title. What's the premise? The boy who was raised as a dog.
That was one of the stories that he shared in there. So I think all of the chapters in that book are from different kind of children in cases that he worked with. And so one of the cases was about severe abuse and neglect in a child who was, contained and locked up. So that's one of the stories, right? And he has stories in there. He worked with the children who survived what happened in Waco, Texas, way back with the David Koresh cults and things that were going on there. So to work with all the children that survived that was quite an interesting experience.
That is quite the story.
Yeah.
So I'm a big student of politics as well, and those children not only had the trauma of being raised in that environment, but it appears they were also firebombed by the United States government.
Yeah.
So it's a pretty horrific situation.
And to think about, forecasting forward, how does that impact their brains at this age? I mean, I can't remember how many years ago that was, but they've
1990s.
They've probably gone on to have children of their own.
Yeah.
Right? So how does that impact the brains to come? It's a fascinating read, just all the different amazing experiences he's had and the things that he's learned about how trauma impacts the brain. He's very involved in advocating to government as well, because I think when you have this information, then do something with it, right? Is how do we get government to flip-flop the funding so that we're valuing early childhood education as much as we're valuing university. And we don't see that.
Right.
We don't see that at all.
That's very true.
Yeah.
Very true. Tell us about the Child Advocacy Center.
So the Child Advocacy Center is a project that the Kelowna Foundation is bringing into fruition, and it is essential for us as a community to have a place where children who've experienced abuse can go to receive the services they need under one roof. So, prior to, this will open later this year, but currently children have to go to multiple different services when they've disclosed abuse or when there's concerns about their safety. And that's really difficult.
Yeah.
And then having to tell this story multiple times or having to tell it to multiple different grown-ups is, again, a very difficult piece. So the Child Advocacy Center will bring together the RCMP, MCFD, justice, and health so that children can see a doctor if they need to have a forensic exam. Children can be interviewed in the same building. That if they need to, be connected with Crown or whatever might happen in that process.
Crown a prosecutor.
Yeah.
Like if there's violence.
Yeah. Or if there's a court case.
Right.
If there's charges that will have to, say the child may need to go and testify.
Yeah.
So all of that will happen under one roof now. And there'll be consistency in terms of who does the child have to need to talk to and who's available for the family members as support. I've been involved in that project Murphy and I have been involved in that project for over 5 years. And we got involved because we're super passionate about having developmentally appropriate therapeutic interventions for children, but also that animals need to be part of this facility. Because when a child needs to testify, it's so much easier if there's a court dog.
Right.
It's so much easier if they have a dog at their feet that is just there to help them regulate and to be presence for them. We get better testimony. if dogs are part of that process. And that's not something Murphy can do because he's not a facility dog. So I can prep kids for court and we can get all ready, but he can't accompany them, which is very, very difficult. So part of why we continue to be connected and passionate about this is we just want to make sure that the animals are there available for children that want them, and that we as a community come together and do a better job of this all around.
So the children build a relationship with this animal before. The animal doesn't show up for the first time when the child is on the stand.
Typically you'd want to introduce the dog, right?
Yeah.
So you don't want surprise.
Right.
And so like in ideal situation, I mean, Murphy could do the therapy piece with a child for, I've worked with children for 2 years as we're prepping for court. And then we can say, oh, it's time, you're going to meet this other dog now. And his job is to come and sit with you in court. And, he knows Murphy and we can do this lovely little bridge, right?
Yeah.
And so there would be an introduction first.
So it's specialized training that the dog has.
It's very specialized. And it's expensive.
And Murphy just wouldn't...
He's not certified for that.
I see.
And he doesn't have that training.
Right.
So those dogs typically would have 2 to 3 years of certification in order to get a facility dog position.
And they will be kept at the facility, these animals?
What will have to happen as part of that process is a handler will need to be identified. So like you asked me earlier, does Murphy come home with me? Yes, he does, because he's my dog, but I'm his handler.
Right.
So I can't give Murphy to another therapist and say, okay, you can take him in session. It doesn't work like that.
Right.
I'm aware of him, he's aware of me, and we have very subtle things that we do together.
Right.
There are some dogs that, maybe could do that, but with a facility dog, it's a big investment. So we need to have the person who's going to be the handler of that dog and located in the center because we need the dog accessible. And so we have to find that person first and then get the dog. So in the interim, Murphy will kind of support and help with the therapeutic piece. He just can't help with any of kind of the facility pieces until we get that dog identified.
I understand.
Yeah.
So many fascinating topics that I didn't know much about. Everybody is aware of child abuse on some level.
Yes.
They know of someone or they've experienced it or someone in their family.
Yeah.
But all these things that are happening in psychology and therapy, it's pretty amazing.
It's very exciting.
So this child advocacy center, is it going to be a location with a published address?
Yes.
Or is, how's it going to work?
It will be located at 1815 Kirshner, which is where the Foundry is located. So you may or may not know about the Foundry services, which are services, mental health and addiction services for youth. So they're located in the bottom, and then upstairs is where the Child Advocacy Center will be. And then downstairs on the other side, Stepping Stones also has an office. So what's happened is this lovely co-location.
Nice.
So that, children who've been upstairs accessing those services, if they need to access therapeutic services either at the Foundry or at Stepping Stones, it's all within this one location.
Nice.
Which really, I think, is going to have such a dramatic difference for
families.
And it
will be open soon in a few months?
Yeah. I think the goal is for the CACs to open in November. Foundry's been open there for a while now and is a well-established.
And what's the Foundry?
The Foundry. Again? So it's a collaboration of community services. It's I don't know how all the funding works, but it's like a provincial service.
Okay.
So it's here in Kelowna. It's run by the Canadian Mental Health Association. And the idea, again, is to bring all the services to one location so that people aren't going to multiple different locations.
Right.
So within the Foundry, you can access doctors, you can access addiction services, you can access yoga, you can access food, you can access pretty much the entire gamut of services you might need as a young person.
So the Advocacy Center is distinct from that?
Yeah, they're all separate businesses and things like that. They just happen to be within the same office building, which is fabulous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But the way you describe the Advocacy Center sounds similar to the Foundry.
Yes. So and I think a lot more services are going in that direction of co-locating the services. Right. To make access easier.
Right.
So same sort of thing in Foundry, just slightly different services. Right?
I see.
Yeah.
I see. Well, that's wonderful.
I know. It's exciting for our community.
Very exciting. Yeah. Deanne, would you like to nominate someone to come on the show?
Thinking about who. There's so many people that come to mind.
And you could nominate more than one.
Yeah. A really interesting gentleman to talk to who's connected to the Foundry is Mike Gowlick.
Okay.
He works at CMHA. He's very involved in our community in terms of homelessness and poverty as well. I really enjoy chatting with him, and he has a really neat brain.
Okay.
Another person I really think does amazing things in our community is Liz Talbot at Now Canada. And they provide services to women and children who've experienced violence and sexual exploitation.
Okay. That's great.
Yeah, they're
wonderful.
Really fascinating people.
Okay.
Thank you.
Well, Deanne, thanks so much for your time today. It's been a fascinating conversation for me.
I like talking about brains and dogs.
Awesome.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed this episode of the Newtown Big Dreams podcast with your host, Luke Menkes, and his authentic guests. And we love our listeners and hope you subscribe now to learn more about the amazing journeys of our incredible guests who relocated to find a new town, big dreams. And remember, make your dreams big.